You were never chosen. You were selected for your compliance, not for your truth, not for your soul, but for your availability. That's what made you useful. Not your depth, not your presence, your predictability. You showed up, even when it hurt. You responded, even when no one deserved your energy. You said yes, just to avoid the tension of being honest. They didn't have to overpower you. They just had to rely on your reflex to appease. And once that was in place, they had control, without ever needing to ask. This is the part no one wants to admit. You weren't being kind. You were being programmed. Somewhere early on, you learned that availability equals safety. That being reachable makes you valuable. That being emotionally generous keeps you close to love. Or at least close to people who pretend to offer it. You learned to measure your worth by how quickly you could abandon yourself for the sake of keeping peace. And when the world rewarded that behavior, you mistook that reward for connection. They didn't teach you to regulate your boundaries. They taught you to regulate their emotions, to manage their insecurities, to anticipate their shifts in tone, to soothe, to explain, to soften. And you learned to do it all without ever checking if you were okay. This is where the wound begins. Not in the people who asked for too much, but in the part of you that believed your survival depended on giving it. You gave love like a performance. You gave time like a debt. You gave energy like it was limitless. Because saying no felt like violence, like rejection, like loss. You said it was just being there for people. But what it really was a trauma contract. I stay useful, you don't leave. Carl Jung called this the persona, but you didn't put on a mask. You became the mask. And in doing so, you built an identity around being emotionally accessible. Someone who absorbs pain, not reflects it. Someone who maintains harmony, even while internally collapsing. And it worked. They liked you that way, because you didn't interrupt their comfort, because you didn't resist being shaped. But here's what no one told you. The more emotionally available you are, the more emotionally invisible you become. They stop asking, they start expecting, they stop appreciating, they start depending, not on you, but on your emotional labor, your constant reply, your soothing tone, your availability on demand, and they begin to confuse your presence with their right to have access. You've been taught to feel guilty for pulling back, to feel selfish for needing space, to feel cruel for going quiet. But what if your silence isn't the problem? What if it's the boundary you were never allowed to set? They don't get angry because you've changed. They get angry because you've stopped performing. Because now the version of you they could count on to dissolve in their favor isn't showing up anymore. And suddenly, their comfort is no longer your job. Carl Jung wrote about psychic energy, not as a metaphor, but as your actual life force. What you pay attention to, what you react to, what you carry that isn't yours. And if you've been feeling drained, disoriented, resentful, it's not because something's wrong with you. It's because you've been spending your energy on maintaining a self that was never real. That's the wound. You weren't taught to belong to yourself. You were taught to be available, to meet the moment with softness, to absorb other people's projections, to prioritize being wanted over being whole. But the truth is simple. If your value only exists in how much you give, you will never be seen, only used. And the longer you stay reactive, agreeable, and emotionally reachable, the easier it is to keep you trapped in someone else's narrative. And what happens when that version of you suddenly stops showing up? When the person they depended on to soothe, to respond, to rescue, goes silent? That's when the game begins. Let's go there. They didn't need to manipulate you. They just needed you to stay predictable. That was enough. You thought you were making choices, but you were running a script. One that told you every silence must be filled, every withdrawal answered, every discomfort softened. They didn't train you. They didn't have to, because the world already had. Every time you responded immediately. Every time you clarified, explained, justified. Every time you chased emotional resolution before they even asked for it, you reinforced the pattern. Not just for them, for yourself. You kept proving that all someone had to do was shift their tone, pull back, or go quiet, and you'd break your own boundary to re-establish the connection. This is the trap. They never had to ask for control. You gave it to them, piece by piece, through your reactions, because you thought the relationship would collapse if you didn't maintain it. And maybe it would have, but that would have told you everything. You were emotionally available, but what you really were was emotionally accessible, and accessibility made you programmable. They learned that if they withdrew just a little, you would overfunction, that if they delayed their response, you would increase your effort, that if they acted cold, you would become warm to balance the tension. You weren't connecting, you were performing. Not because you're weak, because your nervous system was trained to associate emotional repair with safety. Somewhere along the line, you learned that reactivity keeps the peace, that if you anticipate their needs, you might prevent their withdrawal, that if you always respond, you can avoid being replaced. That wasn't care. That was conditioning. And it worked for them, because they didn't have to meet you in the middle. They just had to lean back and let your guilt do the rest. They never needed to control you directly. Your fear of disconnection controlled you for them. They didn't relate to you. They related to your availability, to the way your body tensed to answer their silence, to the way your tone softened when they were cold, to the way your energy surged when they pulled away just enough to make you panic. And you called it love, because your reaction felt like connection. But what it really was codependence disguised as intimacy. You were never safe. You were just compliant enough to avoid being punished. That's not peace. That's submission. And the longer you stayed in that pattern, the more they trusted your reaction to stabilize their discomfort. You became the emotional infrastructure for people who never learned to self-regulate. And every time you responded, every time you anticipated, soothed, replied, you deepened the illusion that they were stable and you were emotional. But all you were doing was running the nervous system response that kept them comfortable and kept you imprisoned. This is how projection works. They cast a role, you fulfill it. Not because you want to, but because not doing so feels like a threat. And they learn. If they press silence, you speak. If they create tension, you fix. If they disappear, you chase. You were predictable, and predictability became your prison. So what happens when you stop? When you don't explain? When you don't rush in? When you don't react at all? The system collapses. Because now, the person they built their comfort around no longer exists. They can't extract clarity. They can't use your reaction as a mirror. They can't use your presence as regulation. They are left with themselves, and they were never ready for that. But neither were you. Because if your identity was built around keeping everyone else emotionally safe, then without the performance, who are you? Let's unpack that now. You stop responding, and everything goes silent. At first, it feels like peace. Then it feels like loss. And then, it doesn't feel like anything at all. Because when your identity was built around emotional labor, removing that labor doesn't bring clarity. It brings collapse. Not just collapse of roles, collapse of self. Who are you when you're not over-explaining? Who are you when you're not anticipating other people's discomfort? Who are you when no one is watching and you have nothing left to fix? The answer isn't empowering. It's empty. Because you didn't just give yourself away. You became what others needed, so completely that there's no you left beneath the reaction. Only a nervous system waiting for its next instruction. This isn't burnout. This is identity death. Your body doesn't know what to do without the pattern. Your mind loops in search of an audience. Your emotions short-circuit without a place to land. You don't feel calm. You feel erased. Because the collapse isn't just psychological. It's existential. You didn't lose yourself. You never had one. You had a role. You had a reflex. You had a script. And now it's gone. This is the moment where most people run back. Back to the noise. Back to the pull. Back to the familiar pain. Not because they want to, but because emptiness feels more dangerous than dysfunction. Because at least in dysfunction, you had something to do. Someone to respond to. Somewhere to direct your energy. Now there's only stillness. Only space. And your nervous system reads that space as a threat. This is the cost of detachment. Not freedom. Not clarity. But psychic disintegration. You were never taught how to sit in silence. You were taught to rescue, repair, respond. And now that there's no one to perform for, you realize your entire selfhood was stitched together by external validation. Not praise, not applause, but relevance. You were relevant when needed, useful when wanted, visible when reacting. Now, you are none of those things. And the void doesn't applaud you for setting boundaries. It stares back. This is what Soren Kierkegaard called the despair of the aesthetic self, the self that only exists in relation to others. It cannot survive solitude because it was never built on truth, only optics. So when the mask falls, when the performance ends, you're left with the raw, unstructured ache of a soul that's never been met by its owner. And Jung warned, without a confrontation with the shadow, with all the parts of you that faked, pleased, and performed, the persona becomes pathological. Because you start to believe you are the role, you start to protect the mask more than your essence. And when the mask is removed, you panic. Because there is no self to protect. Just a body. Just a void. Just awareness. Staring into the quiet and realizing it has no identity outside of usefulness. This is the collapse. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But silent. You don't scream. You don't cry. You just stop. Your gestures lose meaning. Your voice feels foreign. Your preferences dissolve, and all that's left is the unbearable stillness of a life you never consented to, but lived anyway. Most people call this depression, but it's not. It's unmasking. It's the death rattle of a false identity. It's the mourning of a self that was always a survival strategy. You're not broken. You're just no longer useful to a system that only valued your reactivity. And now you face the one question you've spent your whole life avoiding. If I'm not who they needed me to be, then who am I? Keep listening. This is where it begins to shift. You thought the silence was the collapse. It wasn't. It was the reveal. Because what came apart was never you. It was the scaffolding you mistook for identity, the survival mask, the emotional prosthetic, the network of learned responses you used to stay safe in unsafe places. You never had a self. You had a function. You were never chosen. You were selected, based on how well you contorted. Not seen, but scanned for utility. You weren't loved for your truth. You were depended on for your reaction. And when that reaction stopped, the illusion shattered. But here's the reframe. The pain you feel now isn't abandonment. It's withdrawal from being needed for the wrong reasons. And the ache that's growing isn't loneliness. It's the sensation of finally being real in a world that only knew how to mirror your performance. You were never yourself. You were a feedback loop, a mirror made of nerves, tuned to everyone else's volume. And it worked until you stopped tuning. Now the signal is gone, and all that's left is static. That static is where your real voice lives. And it's not smooth. It's not refined. It's raw, cracked, and barely formed. Because you never got to use it. What you called overthinking was actually hypervigilance. What you called caring too much was fawn response dressed up as empathy. What you thought was loyalty was nervous system dependency, a trauma bond mistaken for connection. And what felt like love was just mutual regulation built on your self-abandonment. You kept the peace, but only because you sacrificed your truth. You performed stability, but only because you didn't feel safe enough to be seen breaking. You became emotionally available by becoming emotionally absent to yourself. And now, you're waking up in the wreckage of that role. But this isn't the end. It's the start of the only relationship that ever mattered. The one between you and the parts of yourself you silenced to be accepted. The shadow you buried to be palatable. The truth you edited to avoid rejection. The instinct you denied to stay predictable. They never wanted the real you. They wanted the version that made them feel more real. And you obliged until now. Now you're dangerous. Not because you're cruel. Not because you've changed. But because you're no longer available to be someone else's mirror. You're no longer confusing approval with alignment. Closeness with connection. Comfort with love. This is the reframe. You weren't weak for reacting. You were trained to equate reactivity with safety. You weren't broken for being accessible. You were conditioned to believe that love must be earned through sacrifice. You weren't lost. You were fragmented, scattered across 1,000 performances that kept you relevant, but hollow. And now, for the first time, you can see all the pieces. Not as defects, not as shame, but as proof that you are still here. Still capable of truth, still able to stop performing. But here's the threshold. If you don't rebuild with truth, you will rebuild with performance. If you don't embody your silence, you will fill it with noise. If you don't choose stillness, chaos will choose you. This is your decision point. Not a resolution, not a recovery, but a reckoning. You've seen the trap. You've survived the collapse. Now ask yourself, will I rebuild with performance, or finally, with presence? We'll discuss this deeper in the next section. There's no applause when you stop explaining. There's no standing ovation when you choose silence. There's only the weight of your own presence, finally returned to you. No one celebrates your boundaries, because they were never made for them. They were made for you. You don't set boundaries to control others. You set them to protect reality. Your reality. The one you've spent a lifetime editing, managing, contorting, just to make others comfortable in your presence. Now you're done. And in that decision, you learn the final truth. You never owed anyone an explanation. Not for your quiet, not for your distance, not for your becoming. Embodiment is not a performance. It's the end of performance. It's not about appearing powerful. It's about being unavailable to anything that requires your self-betrayal. You don't raise your voice. You don't defend your boundaries. You become them, not through force, but through absence. When you stop explaining, you stop leaking your essence. You stop outsourcing your worth to the reaction it provokes. This is power. Not the loud kind, the kind that's so still it becomes untouchable. Embodiment means your nervous system is no longer up for negotiation. You no longer absorb chaos, translate dysfunction, hold space for those who weaponize their wounds. You are not rude. You are not cold. You are clear. And clarity is what collapses codependence. You don't attend every conflict. You don't correct the misinterpretations, because you finally understand what they project onto your silence was never yours to fix. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the will to power. Not power over others, but power over one's own reactivity. The ability to sit in misunderstanding and not flinch. To feel the discomfort of being misread and stay rooted. To let the story go unfinished, the text go unanswered, the gaze go unreciprocated, without compromising your truth. Camus called it defiance, not in rage, but in refusal. The refusal to abandon your center, just to be legible to those who never knew how to read you. This is what it means to embody your healing. You no longer prove it. You live it. Without permission, without performance. And sometimes that means disappearing from the narratives that once defined you. Embodiment isn't about adding new habits, it's about subtraction. You subtract the noise, you subtract the guilt, you subtract the emotional inflation that kept you tethered to other people's approval. And in that subtraction, you find what was never lost, only buried: stillness. Stillness is not silence. It's sovereignty. It's the quiet that remains when nothing external has access to your internal state. It's the gaze that doesn't chase, the presence that doesn't perform, the yes that isn't afraid of saying no. This is what it costs to no longer be available. It costs visibility. It costs relatability. It costs proximity to the people who only loved you for your compliance. But what you gain cannot be named, only felt in your spine, in your breath, in your refusal to fold. Buddhism calls this non-attachment, not indifference, but freedom from compulsion. The compulsion to explain, to fix, to be liked. You don't need to be liked, you need to be real. And real doesn't need validation. It needs space. Embodiment is space, from the past, from performance, from pressure. It's not easy, it's not glamorous, but it's yours. And here's the final fracture. If you don't stay empty long enough for your truth to rise, you will fill the void with someone else's noise. Stay empty. Stay uncomfortable. Stay unseen. Because what emerges next will not be a version of you they recognize. It will be the version that never needed recognition. So what happens now? You come back, but not as they knew you. You enter the room and it tilts. Not because you say anything, but because you don't. The old version of you would have filled the space, smoothed the silence, asked the questions, made it easier. But that version is gone, and the space stays awkward. You let it. They don't know what to do with you now, because you no longer offer the signal they depended on. You're no longer broadcasting safety. You're no longer holding the thread of emotional coherence for everyone in the room. You've withdrawn the invisible labor, the tether, and in that absence, their control fractures. They call you distant, cold, selfish, but what they're really saying is, I can't use you anymore. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you that made them feel secure, centered, in charge. And now that you've stopped offering it, they're left alone with the mirror. They don't like what they see. This is the cost of return. You don't re-enter the world to be embraced. You re-enter the world to see it clearly, to see what loved you only when you were small, only when you were available, only when you were useful. Now, you're none of those things, and the room feels colder. But that's the price of being real. People don't recognize you because you've stopped reflecting them. You've stopped flinching, stopped chasing, stopped decoding micro-shifts in tone just to stay one step ahead of rejection. You sit still. You say less. And the silence between words becomes unbearable for those who were only ever comfortable in your performance. Jung said the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But he was wrong. The most terrifying thing is to accept yourself completely, and then walk back into a world that only knew how to love your mask. You are not angry. You are not bitter. You are gone. From the version of yourself they knew how to manipulate. From the storylines they wrote with your reactions. From the choreography you used to follow, just to belong. Now, you move differently. Not to provoke, but because you're not moving for them anymore. The absence they feel is your liberation. The awkwardness they project is their own dependence, collapsing. You've become unreadable. And for the first time, you're not trying to be understood. You stopped making yourself small so others could stay comfortable. You stopped narrating your worth in a language that required translation. Now, your presence is quiet, contained, unapologetically whole, not inflated, not defended, just sovereign. This is what freedom feels like. Not power, not control, just unavailability to anything that demands your distortion. Now you remember, you were never included. You were consumed. And now that you've withdrawn, they have nothing left to feed on but their own discomfort. You won't be invited back. Not really. You won't be reabsorbed. Not unless you shrink again. And you won't. Because this time, you remember what it costs. This time you remember who you are when no one's watching. And that is the version of you worth losing the world for. They'll say you vanished, that you went cold, that you became someone else. But they're wrong. You didn't become someone else. You stopped being someone for them. Because that's what availability really was. A performance. A constant translation of your truth into something palatable, manageable, useful. But now, there's nothing left to translate. No more softening your voice. No more rehearsing your tone. No more shaping yourself into the version they can digest. You've gone quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally realized they weren't listening, they were editing. The silence is not a void, it is a refusal to be interpreted by people who only see what serves them. You didn't disappear, you detethered from the emotional economy that expected you to offer yourself in exchange for proximity. You stopped paying for connections that cost your authenticity. And suddenly, the invitations dried up. The check-ins stopped. The warmth evaporated. But none of it was yours. You were just the power source. Now that you've unplugged, they're left in the dark. And it's not your job to explain the blackout. You became unavailable. And what collapsed wasn't your identity. It was the illusion that you ever needed to be anything but whole. This is the end of the loop. No more decoding passive aggression. No more proving you're not too much, too cold, too intense. You are not too anything. You are not available for interpretations that shrink you. You've stopped existing through the eyes of others and started existing in your own skin. Do they feel your absence? Of course. But not because they miss you. Because they miss the role you played in maintaining their sense of control. You were a mirror, and you've shattered it. They no longer get to see themselves in your compliance. You didn't just walk away. You stopped feeding the system that depended on your emotional labor. And like any starving organism, it lashes out. It mourns. But you won't come back. Because you finally understand, peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the absence of performance. You don't need closure. You don't need understanding. You need oxygen. And this silence, this vast, sacred, untouchable silence, is where you finally breathe. You are not gone. You are just no longer visible to the ones who refused to see you whole. This is not exile. It's emergence. Not from a cage, but from a choreography you were never meant to dance. And now, let this be the line you never cross again. Write this below. I am no longer available to be used. Let it be your severance. Clean, final, unseen. Because the next time they call your name, they won't hear an echo. They'll hear nothing. Not because you've disappeared, but because you're done performing. And this silence, this stillness, it's not revenge. It's a boundary, etched in bone, lit by fire, held in peace. You are no longer available. And that is the most radical, most powerful, most unshakable form of freedom they'll never understand. Let them miss what you never truly were. You're not coming back. Not this time. Not ever.